So what I'm going to give a talk about is a chapter in Kierkegaard's works of love that is probably not as famously covered in the reception of the work as probably other chapters are. The one where Kierkegaard is talking about love hiding a multitude of sins. You know, it's a rather short, small chapter in the second part of the book. And what interested me in it was that there, I think, are some connections, not only in vocabulary, but also in some systematic points that Kierkegaard proper is making that resound if you have read the Climacus works as well, especially the postscript, where there are certain passages where Climacus writes of the so-called authentative religious individuality and characterizes it in a way that is really resounding if you read it on the background of what Kierkegaard does in works of love. So I shared with you my working document here, and I will proceed in a way that I will maybe go into the possible discussions of some objections that I am going to raise, but also that could be raised against my reading at the end of the talk. But since there might not be enough time, I might skip that section, but we can look into that at the end of the talk, I think. All right, so as a kind of motto introducing the second part of Either Or, containing the papers of Judge William, we find on the title page a quote from French romanticist François Chateaubriand, that goes like this. So the original French is Les grands passions sont solitaires, et les transporter au désert, c'est les rendre à leur empire. The English translation is somewhat less poetic. From Hong and Hong, it says that the great passions are hermits, and to transport them to the desert is to hand over to them their proper domain. Now, whether it was the editor who found William's papers, Victor Eremita, that put it in front of them, or whether it was the judge himself, it might strike one as odd that it should be the ethical standpoint from which we are to hear something about great passions, let alone about them being solitary. After all, the intuition seems only natural that ethics is primarily concerned with our relations to others, as well as with the normative principles that should govern our conduct within these relations, precisely by not being grounded upon our affections or passions. Given that the judge ends his two lengthy letters with an added sermon by a pastor friend of his, from Jylland nonetheless, we can surmise that he himself has not quite taken up residence in the lone desert that is the proper domain, to paraphrase Climacus, of the greatest passion of all, namely faith. The judge's own letters can thus be seen as covering the realm between such religiousness, literal and figurative solitude on the one side, and the desperate absorption in fulfilling worldly striving his younger friend, the ascetic, is suffering from, and to whom said letters are addressed on the other side. Though this admittedly very basic overall picture seems to support us with a fairly accurate view on the existential spheres Kierkegaard distinguished, it also leaves us with the impression that what constitutes the ethical sphere is not altogether clear. At first sight, at least, and keeping in mind as background the judge's letters themselves, it seems to amount to a strange compound of tempered passions, an acquired taste for duty without it being directed outward in a classically ethically relevant sense that is anticipated in the intuition articulated above, and the kind of faith that seems content with not being asked for too much, at home far away from the pastor's Jylland and Abraham's Mount Moriah. If, in the hope for clarification, we leave the isolation of the judge's cozy, stable marriage and turn to Kierkegaard's other pseudonyms, however, I argue that we are likely to encounter the same vagueness when trying to spell out what the ethical actually consists in. This is not to say, of course, that within a fully lived existence, one that comes to terms with and integrates the different aspects that are borrowed from each sphere, there must be a sharp distinction between them, and each be granted its own specific quality and scope. In that regard, we might indeed learn a lot from the judge and certainly admire Kierkegaard's psychological finesse in the construction of his character. But since especially Climacus invests considerable effort to keep their distinctiveness intact, even complaining that, quote, in our day, everything is mixed together, one responds to the aesthetic ethically, to faith intellectually, etc., it is not an entirely convincing strategy to resort to this argument for rejection. In what follows, I would like to address this issue by spelling out a point of agreement between Climacus in the postscript and Kierkegaard proper in the works of love. As I take it, they both primarily view our relations to others as having relevance not on ethical but on religious grounds. I will try to show first that the form these relations take on that is essential for said agreement is not so much the one of a practical deed itself, with the neighbor as its object, but rather the judgments one makes or suspends of the neighbor's character and deeds. In a second step, I will expand on how especially the work of love, that is its hiding a multitude of sins, helps us in grasping Kierkegaard's notion of a specifically religious relationship that we enter with others. In a final outlook, as I said in the introduction, I will probably skip over that, but we will see. I will briefly present a few difficulties and possible objections remaining that might spur the discussion. All right, section 1. Ethical inwardness and suspending one's moral judgments. Perhaps surprisingly, Climacus advances the view that ethically, the individual is simply and solely interested infinitely in his own actuality, and that therefore, the ethical does not deal with other individuals. As was said before, this conception of what ethics or the ethical sphere is concerned with sounds somewhat counterintuitive. At the very least, it provokes the question what other sphere should be occupied with what we can in most general terms call a sort of normativity implicit in the interpersonal relationships we maintain. In looking for an answer to this question, Climacus, in my view, is not as direct and explicit as in denying any ethically relevant interest in the actuality of others. In a footnote, he says, an authentic religious individuality is always so lenient with others, so inventive in thinking up excuses. Only toward himself is he cold and severe like a grand inquisitor. This is in Concluding on Scientific Postscript 389. It is in judging others that we leave the relatively isolated realm of our self-relation, within which the ethical so far confronted us only with self-evident demands that condemn any delay in or excuse from fulfilling them, through which our religiousness in a way becomes manifest, knowable as it were by its fruits, its possible works of love. Not only is our own actuality the only one we can be ethically interested in and feel responsible for, as Climacus holds, it is also the only actuality that we can truly know. For any other person, we only know from the outside, from perceiving the fruits in the form of deeds, and by translating those into options or possibilities we have ourselves when confronted with an ethically relevant choice to be made. Climacus goes so far as to say that, quote, the individual's own ethical actuality is the only actuality. What cannot be conceived of either as an option I myself have at my disposition when it comes to such a situational choice, as a duty I cannot but regard as self-evident and necessarily binding, or as something else relevant to that situation, is not in a modal status of being actual. Though one is inclined to say this simply means that everything and everybody else is just not ethically actual, which would be hard enough to argue for, Climacus does not use that adjective here. What might ease the tension is the context he articulates that most radical formula in. Quote, that this seems strange to many does not surprise me. To me, it seems odd that one has finished with the system and systems without asking about the ethical. In the corresponding section of longer and shorter aphorisms, devoted to the question of how the modalities of actuality and possibility appear in the different spheres of existence, he famously addresses his subjectivist maxim at Hegelian idealism, criticizing it for its lack of ethical enthusiasm, or indeed, any kind of ethical interest at all, and for confusing those modalities, since it only tends to treat them within the realm of abstract possibility anyway, as in Hegel's Science of Logic. Whatever the case, as ethical actualities, we are enclosed in our very own little spheres of existence. This conception of ethical inwardness might already hint at a possible problem that comes with reading Climacus while having works of love in mind. With the latter, we could ask, if we never quite come to know another person's own completely inward ethical actuality, except by conceiving of it as a possibility for ourselves, then how can the potential well-intentionedness of that other person, and our own for that matter, become manifest in our respective outwardly directed deeds? However, I believe that by pointing our attention to the religious individuality, Climacus himself opens up a path we can follow to avoid that complication, even within his own framework in the postscript. Following this path, I would like to turn to the rest of the sentence cited above. Climacus characterizes the religious individuality by its being so lenient with others as inventively thinking up excuses for them. This again already presupposes that we very well might have some preconceived notion of how to judge other persons' deeds and their characters. The judgments we form by default, automatic as it were, might furthermore be all but flattering, neither for the one judged nor for ourselves. Indeed, on a day-to-day basis, it seems almost infuriatingly easy to be content with such instantaneous judgments, since they neither require a lot of cognitive work to put into, nor a particularly well-developed empathy. The religious individuality, by contrast, is so sympathetic with others that it even comes up with something like an excuse or mitigating explanation when it has encountered an obvious wrongdoing, even then supposing that there still might have been a good intention behind it. As we will see when discussing the relevant chapter of in Works of Love, one can also suspend one's judgment, even for an arbitrarily long time, in order not to unjustly come to a conclusive one. And even then, there is something that one can do in order to mitigate the wrong conclusion. However, as we can note in passing by, it now again becomes somewhat difficult to discern the self-relation of this religious Grand Inquisitor from simply being an ethically developed individual that knows its duty, admits when it has failed to act accordingly, and regrets its failure to do so without ever casting a shadow of a doubt on the validity and self-evidence of that duty. With his conception of the religious individuality that transcends its own ethical inwardness through its leniency in judging others, through uttermost sympathy that even goes so far as to let the creativity of its imagination come up with excuses and explanations when, based on its natural default setting, there can hardly be any of those, Climacus, I believe, is in striking agreement with Kierkegaard proper. I would now like to expand on this agreement. Section 2, Mitigation and Leniency as Love's Default Setting. By now, we have tried to make sense of how and why the ethical is not conceived of by Climacus and Kierkegaard as the sphere within which interpersonal relations are dealt with or accounted for. We have seen that Climacus provides us with the model of an authentic religious individuality, whose religiousness, as we can state thus far, consists in judging others as leniently as possible. It is no coincidence that Climacus uses the word inventive in describing such a person's faculty that is at work when trying to come up with those clement judgments, besides, of course, the loving sympathy it has to have for other persons, which is imagination. In works of love, Kierkegaard proper even develops an analogy between a detective or a judge, whereby it is doubtful whether Judge William could play that role though, that have to collect and interpret clues in order for a mysterious crime to be solved, and the lover's inquisitorial capacity to explain a wrongdoing as something else or away completely. And now I quote a longer section from Works of Love. Let the judge appointed by the state, let the servant of justice work at discovering guilt and crime. The rest of us are called to be neither judges nor servants of justice, but on the contrary are called by God to love. That is, with the aid of a mitigating explanation, to hide a multitude of sins. Imagine such a loving person, equipped by nature with the most magnificent capacities, for which every judge is bound to envy him, but with the zeal and the service of love, in order to practice the art and to carry on the art of interpretation that with the help of the mitigating explanation hides the multitude of sins. Imagine his rich, his in the noblest sense blessed experience, how acquainted he is with the human heart, how many remarkable and also moving instances he knows about, in which, no matter how complicated they seemed, he still succeeded in discovering the good, or at least the better, because he had suspended his judgment for a long, long time, until sure enough, a little circumstance came to light that gave him the clue. How by quickly and boldly concentrating all his attention on a totally different view of the matter, he had the good fortune to discover what he was looking for. How he finally was victorious with his explanation by really immersing himself in a person's life situation, by securing the most accurate information about his circumstances. Such a religiously inspired, loving servant of justice is denying the validity of a possible immediate judgment that views the one judged in negative light, but restrains himself instead to come up with such a mitigating explanation. In doing so, he must be able to suspend his judgment for a long, long time, as we have read. And we could almost add, the thoroughly religious lover can suspend it during the time, for as long as he remains in temporality. In this regard, Kierkegaard again is in full agreement with Climacus, who, to further argue for his point that there's no ethical relation between individuals, cites the Bible. Scripture teaches, "Judge not, that you be not judged." This is said as an admonition and warning, but is also an impossibility. One person cannot ethically judge another because the one can understand the other only as a possibility. Thus, when someone is occupied with wanting to judge another, this is a manifestation of his weakness, that he is only judging himself. Of course, one can ask if the sins that are hidden by such explanations, as opposed to discovering them by being inquisitorial in the factual sense of the word, do not still go on to exist. And Kierkegaard repeatedly rebuts the question, not only because one achieves nothing good by keeping them in the open, by spreading the word of his neighbor's sins through gossip and rumors, but also because even if something was conclusively judged to be a sin, which is in itself a kind of presumptuousness, there would be a whole array of further means and methods at love's disposal that Kierkegaard lists. What love cannot hide through keeping silent, as the erotic lover probably does best, since he naturally remains blissfully ignorant of the flaws of the beloved altogether, at least in the first flares of his love, or explaining away, it forgives. The most important thing to note is that said explanations are the results of a choice, as Kierkegaard wants us to understand. Quote, "But if it is a choice, it is always in my power, if I am the one who loves, to choose the most lenient explanation. To do this, then, becomes our altered default setting. To use a phrase David Foster Wallace famously made use of in his commencement speech, This is Water. What unites all kinds of love, in this view, then, is that it is in no lover's interest to ever arrive at a possibly devaluating judgment about the beloved. And even if such a judgment becomes somehow inevitable, the lover would rather hand it over to eternal oblivion or forgive it in order to make it unseen again, as it was unseen when it was still hidden for the happily ignorant lover. All right, so this would now be the end of my written talk, but I think since I have 1 or 2 minutes left, I would maybe like to direct your attention to possible difficulties that could arise when we consider the distinction between the spheres of existence by looking at either Climacus or Kierkegaard proper in the works of love. So a few of those I have already mentioned, one of them being that if we ask what the actual content or the actual qualifying characterization of the ethical sphere should be, then we arrive at certain problems if we take Climacus by his own word. Because he says that there's really only one kind of actuality that we can sensibly talk about, which is each and everyone's own ethical actuality. And all our relations to other ones, to other persons whose deeds and character we are supposed to judge or not to judge, we only get by interacting with them on a religious basis, right? Love is conceived of, even by Climacus himself, as an act of a religious relationship or a form of entering into a religious kind of relationship to somebody else. But if that is the case, we cannot really explain what differentiates this figure of the Grand Inquisitor that Climacus drew from the kind of still only ethical relationship that everybody of us only maintains to oneself. So that's at least one issue that I thought was coming up when comparing the writings of those two on the subject of those two existential spheres. And another more like biographic instance of such a problem would be that when we look at the history of Kierkegaard's own disengagement from Regine, for example, there's a tendency of Kierkegaard himself to theorize his disengagement and to support his own acts with certain reasons. But in doing so, he kind of forced Regine to view his deeds as intrinsically bad, right? He made it as difficult as possible for her to judge his deeds in a good and loving manner. So he set the bar pretty high. And it remains up for discussion, I think, if the bar was not set too high. I mean, there's other resources that Kierkegaard proper provides us with in the works of love that I have mentioned, you know, the kind of successive arrays of means that love has at its disposal in order to deal with what has already been judged as a sin, namely to just keep silent about it or to forgive it altogether. But this is a hard position to be put in Regine's case, which makes it somehow difficult to kind of apply Kierkegaard's more theoretical thoughts about the hiding of a multitude of sins to the specific instance, which has a major practical significance or has one, at least for both of them. So those were kind of issues that came up when I tried to make sense of how we can use, you know, this synergy between Climacus and Kierkegaard when it comes to this concept of hiding a multitude of sins by being inventive about them being hidden, and by developing our capacity as an altered default setting to explain things that we ordinarily would judge to be bad deeds or signs of a bad character somehow differently, and to even make use not only of our sympathy but also of our imagination when it comes to suspend our judgments or to make them as leniently and mitigatingly as possible. So these were only some further inputs for discussion, but I think we will have enough to talk about even without them. So thank you very much for your attention. And I'm looking forward for your questions.